Hello! Hello! Sorry, I can't keep a straight face after that. Oh man, that was funny. Anyways, my name is Cinnamon Roll, and I'm building a school bus into my full-time home. If you're new here, welcome, and if you're a returning viewer, welcome back. In last week's video, I painted the floors with this Chassis Saver paint. I didn't get all the corners and the wheel wells, so that was next on the list. I also did a second coat on the back window. This worked fairly well to block out light, but it's a very expensive way to do this, so I decided to do this differently in the future. One of the things I decided to keep was this heater core so that I could have window defrost in the winter. The idea was that I could draw air through the heater core with this blower and vent it up onto the windshield. My hope was that this, in combination with the fans the bus came with, would be able to keep the windows ice and fog free in the colder months. Now originally this heater was mounted to the bottom of this heater core, but because I'm only using it for window defrost, I decided to move it to the top so that there's less duct work to do. This wouldn't be a bus video if I didn't include some wiring, so of course, here we are. I yet again worked on removing unneeded wiring using the diagram on the access door to reference what circuits do what. By the way, have you guys noticed that the flickering from the last few videos is gone? That's because at this point I switched back to my better camera. So I stopped using my good camera because I kinda ruined the lens and the picture isn't as clear as I would like it to be. That said, I'd rather have a slightly blurry picture than flickering, so I switched back to the good camera. I pulled off the gauge cluster here because I thought that I needed to trace some wires in behind there, but it turns out that I didn't need to do that, so I ended up abandoning this partway through. I ended up removing about 3/4 of the switches from this bus because they just weren't needed anymore, and because of that I ended up with a huge mess of useless ground wires. It was the same story for these blue wires which feed power to the backlights of the switches. I simplified both systems as much as I could just to get them out of the way. This was a temporary solution and I would spend more time on this later. Some of the wires didn't really need to be removed, so I just capped them off. It was time to get this roof waterproofed. I used a ratchet strap to pull this side of the curved section inward. And then I welded in some of the more challenging stuff to get it out of the way. I then reinserted this filler section and began the process of riveting it all together. Now there are definitely better ways to do this, but I used a C-clamp to hold the sheet metal in place while I drilled the holes for the rivets. Once I got all the back sheet metal more or less in place, I turned my attention to the front of the slope section. You may recall that I really butchered the cuts on this front section, and so that meant a lot of connecting gaps with welds, which, on thin sheet metal, is rather difficult and annoying to do. Once I got the slope section welded in, finally it was time to connect the two pieces together. Now if it looks like I didn't really know what I was doing, that's because I didn't. There's really not a lot of information online as to how to do these sloped roofs, so I had to figure out a lot of it on my own. So if you appreciate the effort I put into learning all of this, I'd appreciate it if you'd consider subscribing. It's by no means necessary, but it does help my channel grow, and if you feel so inclined, I would be very thankful for your support. I didn't quite get the other side of the bus to lay as flat as I would have liked, so I quickly went back and redid some of the rivets. Now earlier I welded the outside of the metal, and that was just to get everything to sit into place. At this point I switched to welding the inside to add structural strength. I also filled in some holes with welding to see how well it works, and honestly, it went fairly well. Now in last week's video, I drilled holes in the sheet metal so that I could pull it over the bus with straps, but obviously I couldn't leave them like that. The problem is that when I drilled these holes, I pushed the area outwards, so I had to hammer them back inwards so that I could fill them with body filler. I then used the grinder to smooth everything out as best as I could. So I needed a way to fill these holes, and I debated on a bunch of different ways to do this, until someone mentioned to me that I could use tape as a backer for the body filler. I thought that was a genius idea, so that's what I did. This worked amazingly well to stop body filler from just oozing through the holes and ending up all over the floor. Now, if there's one thing I've learned over the course of building this bus, it's that I really do not enjoy bodywork. Specifically, I don't enjoy working with body filler. This is mostly because I don't like being on a time limit for really anything. Most body filler has a very short working time, so you have to mix it in small batches and get it down very quickly. This doesn't really give me enough time to really get it smoothed out the way I'd like it to be, and my results usually end up being subpar, and I have to do a crud load of sanding to fix it. So one day during the course of recording this video, I looked up and happened to notice that there was a halo around the sun. Now that isn't that uncommon for the area that I live in, but what makes it unusual is that there were these sunspots along the edges of the ring. Some people call them sun dogs or secondary suns or whatever. As you can see in these pictures, these intersected with a secondary halo that circled the entire sky above me. Now this is super cool, and it isn't something you see very often. This usually happens in very cold, dry temperatures, and they're actually the result of very fine ice particles high up in the atmosphere scattering light. It also afforded me the opportunity to get this really cool backlit shot of me on the roof of the bus. Now there were still some pinholes in the body filler, which you can see here. I plan to fix those with some seam sealer later. Now even though the roof was welded along the seams, I wasn't overly confident in those welds, so I decided to add some tabs to the structural supports just to prevent buckling or warping from the movement of the bus. As much of most of my welds so far have sucked, these welds were actually pretty darn good for once, so I felt pretty good about myself for that. I am learning, and I'm getting better. Now that I had finished with the welding and the wiring, for the moment, I decided it was time to attempt to start the bus. Now I had removed the batteries because you can destroy them if you weld on a vehicle with them still connected, so I had to put them back in and reconnect them. My dad tested these batteries and found that one of the three was not taking a charge, so I only put the two good ones back in for now. I will end up buying another battery, but these are very expensive, so for now I had to make do with two. So I hooked these batteries up in parallel. Parallel basically means that I'm running a 12-volt system with two batteries. I connected all the red terminals to each other and all the black terminals to each other. First, I checked to make sure all the switches were turned off to prevent any extra power draw, and then I gave it a go. Well, that didn't go as planned, so I tried again. Seems like the second time was the charm. For not having run in about 6 months, this thing started up pretty nicely. While I had the bus running, I went around and tested all the systems to see what still worked. Unfortunately, my little blower motor wasn't working, so that would be something to fix for later. I also noticed that about half the marker lights weren't working. This could have been a wiring error, or maybe the bulbs were just burnt out, but it didn't really matter because I planned to replace them anyways. And that's it for today's video. Hopefully you enjoyed. Thank you all so much for watching. Seriously, it means the world to me. Enjoy your day, and I'll see you next time.